afterwards. And Kyle, can you advance actually to the next slide? Yeah, but before we get started, I'd like to just put a quick plug in for the Energy Managers Playbook, which is a really interesting and great podcast developed by the Save on Energy support team, and to check it out when you have a chance. And just so you know, also, after the training, you will be receiving an email from surveyinfo@forumresearch.com to provide feedback on the session. And with that, I'm pleased today to introduce today's presenter. We have Kyle Aben, owner of Carbon Realities Consulting, here to lead today's information session on measuring Scope 3 emissions in the commercial sector of Ontario. Kyle is a climate change professional with 16 years of experience in greenhouse gas accounting. He has quantified GHG emissions for companies of all sizes, universities, local governments, communities, heritage sites, and events. Kyle has taught carbon accounting and energy management at the University of Northern British Columbia and at the former Quest University in Squamish. In addition to teaching, Kyle has gained experience working for organizations like the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions, the David Suzuki Foundation, and West Fraser Timber. Welcome, Kyle. And with that, I turn it over to you to take us through the session.
Yeah, thank you very much, Peter. I appreciate that introduction. Yeah, today we have quite a bit to cover, but for the agenda, we just had some ISO updates, so thank you for that, Peter. We're going to go over a bit of the Scope 1 and 2 emissions training. If you hadn't taken that before, it's no worries, but we're just going to go over a bit of the key takeaways from that training, just get you up to date on that before we move into Scope 3. But then I will really focus on, why Scope 3 matters now. Why are you all on the call? Why are we talking about Scope 3 a lot more than we ever have been? So I'll try and talk about that a bit, and then really lay out the 3 scope accounting systems so that if you haven't heard these terms, Scope 1, 2, and 3, by the end, you'll be a true expert on what they all mean. But we are focused on Scope 3, so I'm going to kind of walk you through how I want people to look at Scope 3 and how to really approach it. It's starting with what's called relevance mapping. Scope 3 is a bit more complex than Scope 1 and 2, so there's all sorts of different categories, and our first step is really to make sure whether those categories are relevant to us or not. From there, then we're going to actually do some quantification. So we'll look into those categories that we've deemed material to our organization out of the 15, and then we'll look at some quantification. I do have a bit of math in here today, but don't get too worried. It's just more the concepts than any kind of math that you're going to be seeing. Then we'll talk about reporting and assurance, important for Scope 3, and then I'll leave some time to answer any questions that you may have at the end. Okay, so thanks, Peter, for that introduction. I just really wanted to lay this up quickly because, ISO 14000 and the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, they're kind of coming together right now, which is a good thing. But I have certificates in ISO. I have a certificate as a greenhouse gas inventory quantifier through the Canadian Standards Association, and quite a bit of work experience. So I've had the opportunity to work with all sorts of Canadian companies, right from, nonprofits like David Suzuki Foundation, all the way up to West Fraser Timber, which has, 65 facilities in 4 different countries. So I like our quality of life, and I do believe that I see the full range. So hopefully I'll present that to you as we move forward. The objectives today, pretty straightforward. I want you to understand the fundamentals of quantifying Scope 3 emissions. After this presentation, I want you to be able to say, yeah, I know where to start. And if you have already done an inventory, I know where to iterate to make it better. And so we're going to walk through some practical examples. And like I said, really prepare you to make that first step. A lot of people see the complexity of Scope 3 and they get a little worried and they step back and take their time doing it. But I suggest starting as soon as you can, and it will get easier over time. Okay, so just a few key takeaways from our training that we did for the commercial sector on Scope 1 and 2. I think we all know, and we're going to talk more about Scope 1 and 2 a bit later as well. But Scope 1 and 2 are really the foundation of emission reductions. They're the ones that you have the most control over, and They're really the ones that land in almost all regulatory bodies. Scope 3 you're rarely see in a regulatory setting, but Scope 1 and 2 you almost always do. So it's a very logical starting point for any reduction. As I said, we'll talk a little bit more about that in the coming slides. The second thing we really learned about Scope 1 and 2 is that operational control. So we're using operational control as per the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and ISO 1464. What that does, it just really adds clarity onto the facilities depending on the type of leases. And what that does is says the tenant is always going to have their Scope 1 and 2 emissions as their heat and electricity, and those emissions will always be the landlord's Scope 3. So it simplifies things on that side. And then as well, if everyone in the commercial sector is using the same control approach, there will be less double accounting. Okay, and then the last one we talked about, start with the big sources and then iterate over time. And this is the same with Scope 3, but really even with your Scope 1 and 2, you want to take the biggest ones first. You want to do the best, do your due diligence on finding the best data you can, the best factors you can. And again, don't let perfection delay progress. Okay, so quick rundown of our previous session. But why Scope 3 matters. And so I think this is the number one reason why a lot of people are doing it right now and a lot of organizations are doing it. As I said, it's not regulated, but the number of companies now doing Scope 3 is just dramatically increasing. CDP, for many of you who know it as the Climate Disclosure Project, they've had a bit of a rebranding. They disclose water and forests as well. So they don't want to be just known as the Carbon Disclosure Project anymore. You'll probably see that as a wrong acronym all over the place, but why I put this up is it does require a full Scope 3 assessment to attain top marks. And so a lot of companies, that's the only real reason they're applying or disclosing, I should say, to the CDP about all their climate information, is that they want to look like a good ESG partner. And if you want to do that, you want a high score. So like I said, Scope 3 pretty much has to be in there and has to be verified for you to get those top scores. The second reason why Scope 3 is really becoming more tangible to companies is because those companies that are setting a target based on a science-based target, so that's usually through the Science-Based Target Initiative, they make you do an assessment of your Scope 3 emissions. And if they are over 40% of your total footprint, then you do need to include them in your overall target. So again, this initial scoping that we do is quite important. But as I said, for the most companies, that 40% is a threshold they meet quite easily. So if you want a science-based target that goes by the Paris Agreement, and you need it validated, then as I said, 40% or more, it must be included. And they're not the only disclosure body. So the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures strongly encourages Scope 3 emissions to be reported, where others like the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and ISO 14064 just list them as optional. And then same with the Global Real Estate Sustainability Benchmark, gives higher scores for Scope 3 inclusion, and especially for downstream leased assets, because again, you can imagine how much Scope 3 all those power and electricity emissions are. So here in North America, we found that really the investors are driving a lot of this. So they're the ones looking for these ESG disclosures. There's the ones looking for the higher scores. In Europe, carbon labels, they're on your cereal, they're on everything. So you can make your own decision. They really haven't caught on here in North America, but it is the investors who are driving this. If you don't know about BlackRock and the size of them, please look into it. It's a massive investment firm, and they want those Scope 3. They want you to report on those emissions. And the reason isn't altruistic. It is because they believe that it reduces your risk. If you're looking through your Scope 3 and you're looking through your complete supply chain, it gives you a different perspective than you've ever had of your business, and it will bring to light a lot of risk that you might not have seen previously. So again, not doing it altruistically, but they are pushing this quite a bit. And the last slide on why Scope 3 matters, there's tenant expectations now as well. Large corporation and government tenants, they have all their requirements. There's green leases and sustainability linked lease clauses that are now being looked at. And then Fitwell or lead O&M, what is that? Operations and maintenance tied to tenant performance. So I think it's just a new iteration of lead that actually takes into consideration the health and well-being. Same with Fitwell. We couldn't just build these buildings as energy efficient as we can and forget about the people working within them. And then tenants pursuing net zero targets often ask landlords to disclose and reduce shared or indirect emissions. So, large Canadian real estate investment trusts, they're already reporting Scope 3 categories. And really, people who have done it are reporting that Scope 3 can represent up to 70 to 90% of total emissions for businesses in the commercial sector. Now, again, that varies distinctly between offices and retail and hospitality, but on the whole, it does contribute quite a bit. Okay, so just a quick slide, and then we'll get into the actual process of starting a carbon footprint. But I just wanted to kind of lay these out so that you can see the differences between the three scopes. And if you look at the graph on the right, Scope 1 is in the middle. It's the light blue arrow directly going up. So Scope 1 we'll talk about more, but it is what you own or control. So it's all the heating, fuel production, mobile fuel use, fugitive emissions. It's the easiest one for you really to hold on to because you have those bills readily available and you're usually paying them every month. That's the same that can be said for Scope 2. These are indirect emissions from purchased energy. Almost everyone assumes, and that's that left gray arrow going up to the top. And everyone always assumes it's just electricity, but it's not. If you're near any kind of district heating, heat, steam, or cooling is also included here in your Scope 2 emissions. But then if you look, this graph is kind of dominated by these two purple arrows. And this is where people usually start taking a deep breath and go, oh my goodness. We're going to go through most of these categories. I won't do them now. But what I want you to notice is there's upstream activities and downstream activities. So there's 15 different categories, and they do link them into upstream and downstream. So what's coming into your facility and what's leaving it. It's not always the delineation between upstream and downstream. I'll let you know about that when we get to transportation. But that's usually how you can think about it. So we're going to talk more about each one of these, so don't worry. I'll talk about each one of these categories, but what I wanted to do is just start with where we always start with a carbon footprint. And we always start with measuring our organizational boundary. And so I've talked about this a little bit at the beginning in our key takeaways, but operational control, it is really, I would strongly suggest you use it if you're in the commercial sector. If you're part of a larger multinational company and they've already chosen to use an equity share approach or a financial control approach, then you'll work within those bounds. Or do a separate carbon footprint and have two controls just so you can see them. But really it includes facilities where policies can be implemented. And so why that's important is that a lot of people do not want a facility or emissions included in their target if they don't have control over it. And a lot of times in the other control approaches that you may have that scenario. So we're only going to report emissions from operations we can influence. And so it excludes operations without decision-making authority. A lot of people would argue that the equity share approach is more equitable. If you're getting a profit off something, that it should be in your carbon footprint. But again, I think this argument holds well as also that if you don't have control of it, why would you want it in your carbon footprint? Okay, so I told you we'd go back to Scope 1 and 2 just a couple times, but I do want to really reiterate, just so you can kind of compare Scope 1 and 2 to Scope 3 of what we're focused on today. But direct greenhouse gas emissions, they're the direct ones from owned or controlled sources. So on-site fuel combustion, natural gas for your hot water, if you're burning oil instead of natural gas, whatever that might be. Company-owned vehicles, so fuel burned in your equipment, your trucks, your cars, your forklifts. And then we can't forget about process emissions. So, there's chemical or physical processes not related to energy use. I think for the commercial sector, this isn't probably relevant, but really the fugitive emissions are. So, a grocery store or large labs, you're going to have refrigerant leaks, methane leaks, and maybe even chemical processes, but it's the refrigerant leaks that we're most concerned with. So these are all coming from you directly from your organization. And we always say they're the easiest to account for, but the last couple there can be a bit more difficult. Scope two, we won't spend too much time, as we said, purchase electricity or purchase steam, heat, or cooling. But it is an indirect emission, right? These are not happening at your site. They're happening elsewhere as a consequence of your use at your site, but these emissions are someone else's scope one. And I hope that starts making sense. All scope two and scope three are someone else's scope one emissions, but we'll talk about that a little later. Okay, so now we get into these scope three categories. And so I'm going to take a little bit of time talking about each one as we go forward about which ones that we think would be most relevant to you. But as I said, there's 15 categories and they're broken up into upstream and downstream. The first section is purchased goods and services. So this is one that almost every company has to look closely into. Whatever's coming into your business, there's probably a carbon content associated with getting that product to a usable state to you. So whether that's toasters or paper or office supplies, we'll show an example later. These are all things that you're going to have to attribute their upstream emissions of, raw material, manufacturing, all those emissions to get it to the usable state. It's similar with capital goods. We just have a different definition for capital goods than purchase goods. Your accountants can help you with that, but it's just a longer lived, more useful, longer lived product. So this is where we're really going to focus. If you have new builds, we're going to make sure that we capture all that embodied carbon in the new build through your capital goods. Then we have something called fuel and energy related emissions. And so these are the emissions that it takes to explore for, refine, and deliver these fuels to us in a usable state as well. We're going to talk more about that as an example, so I won't spend too much time here. Transportation, as you can assume, we want to make sure that anything coming to us, we're going to be measuring those emissions. If the transportation that's coming to us is owned by us, then it goes into scope one. If we do not own that transportation and we're just paying for it, then it goes into scope three. Waste management, we'll talk about that a bit more. Where your waste goes will determine how much emissions are associated with that. And we call that upstream because that's leaving your facility. But we'll talk about end of life and downstream as well. And then business travel and employee commuting. So finally, probably a couple sections that you're taking a deep breath that you've heard of and that you've maybe even quantified before. Traditionally, these are the first two scope three categories that a lot of companies try. And I don't blame them. It's good that they're just jumping into scope three. But I hope by the end of this presentation, you realize that we should probably be, doing a relevance mapping for all of them and not just picking out of the hat. But business travel and employee commuting can be important and they shouldn't be forgotten. And then upstream leased assets. So if you do have buildings that you're leasing and you do not own, then you would cover them here. And then downstream transportation is included again. So I mentioned transportation once. You would think intuitively upstream and downstream means coming into your facility and leaving your facility. But the delineation is actually in who pays for it. So if you're sending out your product and you sell your product with transportation included, well, then that transportation should be in scope one. If you sell the product and then just ship it off to some third-party carrier who takes care of it from there, well, then it should be included in scope three. And I hope that makes some sense. I'll take just a quick break after this slide to see if I have any questions. Processing of sold products. So again, if you sell something or produce something that then further goes on to be remanufactured or has more emissions into it before it's a final product, we're concerned with that. And then this one always gets people's eyes rolling, but the use of sold products. So if you are a toaster manufacturer, and I know that's not in the commercial sector, but just as an example, you do have to calculate the emissions from the use of that toaster in its lifespan. So this is where people start going, oh my gosh, like how are we going to do this? But I can assure you, there has been a lot of work done for these things. Manufacturers want to sell their product to people who are measuring these, and so they've done their due diligence a lot of times, and that information is out there for you. And then we've talked about downstream leased assets and then franchises and investments. So these are ones that are usually easy to knock off right away and say that they're not relevant to you if you don't have franchises. And investments, it's usually for a larger firm, but we'll talk about that as well. Okay, so here's where the rubber meets the road. What do we do? We've learned about all these 15 categories, but what are we going to do? And so our goal through relevance mapping is to step back and actually say which of these 15 Scope 3 categories is measurable and material to us. And so we're going to look through, we're going to ask our finance department, our purchasing department, what are our high spend estimates? So what are our top 10 suppliers? What are the top 15 things that we purchased last year? Or expand that list, I would probably honestly suggest even further. And then scan through that to see, well, where are these things coming from? Is it purchase goods and services? Are transportations through the roof? That definitely has to be included. And so you're looking for not just your high spend estimates, but your large activity volumes as well. So you may have some product that you use a lot of, but it's not expensive. So we're not going to forget about those. So it's literally kind of a qualitative and quantitative experiment at the beginning where you're talking to people within your company to try and find out, what it is coming into our company and also what's leaving our company. So again, depending on what type of commercial entity you are, it's going to be quite different for hospitality than retail, but we do have to try and track those things. And then data availability. So at the same time as we're starting to do this relevance mapping, we want to look at what the data format's in. And so originally, we'll probably just ask for some spend estimates to try and get an estimate of those 15 categories, but we want to do better. And what I mean by that is we would love to have some activity data, not just a spend-based estimate. And I will definitely talk more about that coming up because it is an important thing. Data reliability, it's not always going to be the best at the beginning, but that is your goal, is to try and iterate and improve it over time. I said I'd stop for a quick break and see if there's any questions, Peter. Is there any listed there now?
Yes, we do actually have one question. And
Certainly.
the question is, for transportation, in the case of an airport, how do you segregate upstream and downstream emissions? Does it mean emissions related to passengers coming and going out respectively?
Yeah, so again, an airport, I wouldn't want to dive in too deep. I would look for specific guidance, but I would always look for the Scope 3 emissions for transportation, as I mentioned. Are you paying for it with your outgoing product? If so, then it's going to be that upstream. If not, then it's downstream if someone else is paying for it. And then as well, there's downstream transportation from an airport of people coming and going from the airport. And if you were to do a proper quantification, you'd want to look into that as well. Not an easy step, but it is out there. It's same with if you were to go to Home Depot and buy something from them. They've done estimates of their actual people coming to and from their stores, their customers. But the airport example, I wouldn't want to spend too much time on because the complexity there would be significant. But I would assure you there are some guidance out there for you. Okay, so how do we start
Kyle,
doing
sorry,
some...
just one more
go ahead.
question before we move on. So I was on mute,
Certainly.
apologies. One more question. If you hire a contractor to transport goods between two of your own facilities, would this be included in Scope 3?
It would be. Yeah, you don't want to miss those emissions. And since it's a contractor that you've hired, they're the ones purchasing that fuel and they're using it within their own vehicles. So we do not want to miss that at all. That would definitely be included in Scope 3. Yeah, very good question.
Okay, thank you, Kyle.
Okay, so, and this may help the airport question as well, but how do you start doing some of this original relevance mapping? And so, as I mentioned, it's usually what we call a screen-based or a spend-based screening. For years, we've had this amazing tool that was online from Qantas and the Greenhouse Gas Protocol that you could spend, a couple weeks, 3 weeks with your finance department, pulling all these different spend-based estimates all the things coming in and leaving your organization. And then this calculator would just spit out which of the 15 categories it thought it was most relevant to you. And then from there, you would go about measuring them. They've removed that calculator, which is really saddening, but they took a lot of criticism over their spend-based metrics being too broad. So now we kind of have to go through, and once we've gone through and culled some of these categories that aren't relevant to us, say franchises, investments, the others, then we actually have to go through and use some of these spend-based screenings. And so they're called environmentally extended input-output models. And so I've listed some of them here. The US EPA is a very good one. Exiobase, and then DEFRA out of the UK as well has fantastic ones. OpenIO databases. And I list this here for Environment and Climate Change Canada. They do have one, but it's not publicly released as of yet. But just to show you that these are out there and becoming more popular. So from that spend-based, you're going to get kind of what's that term? Order of magnitude that you're looking for each of your categories. But you do want to start refining from there. So that's why I show a hybrid method here. You start with the spend-based, and then you refine the high impacts areas with activity-specific data. And then further from that, we want to get even better. And instead of activity-specific, we want activity-specific supplier-supplied data. In other words, instead of just taking some estimate of a total spend amount for travel, we're going to get right into the iteration and know exactly how many kilometers we traveled. We're going to find out what airplanes they were on. And from those vendors, we'll find out the exact fuel economy of those airplanes. So there's always iteration of a scope 3 quantification. And if you feel year after year that, when you make changes, you feel like, oh, I must have made an error in the previous year. It's okay to have that feeling in scope 1 and 2, but please remember that scope 3 is definitely an iterative process. You will have changes as you go forward, but just document them and be very clear, and you should not have any problem with any verifier or validator. Okay, so from there, I've kind of thought that let's assume that we've gone through and we've done our relevance mapping. And so I wanted to list the categories that I thought would be most relevant to the commercial sector, and then some that will probably be relevant. And again, I can't span the whole gamut of all commercial sectors, but these are the ones I've done my best to really inform you that these are the ones you're probably going to be seeing on your footprint, and then some others you might not. So we've talked about category 1 a little bit. So most firms outsource services and purchase large volumes of supplies. We really don't ever estimate those upstream emissions from those supplies. And you don't make a paper box without emissions. You don't make a staple without emissions. But are staples going to be so much in your organization that you're going to be measuring them materially? Probably not. And I can actually tell you that I have measured staples in different settings just to see, because people thought that it might be material. This is where you really go through the spend base first to cull out all those smaller ones. You're not going to be wasting a lot of your time on, I shouldn't say paper boxes, because depending on what you're in, it may be relevant. But staples and some of these smaller things, you're not going to be looking at all these tiny things that you might purchase. You're going to be looking at the bulk purchases, the largest volumes of supplies coming in either by spend or by volume. And so I hope that makes sense. You're just trying to really capture the emissions it took for them to produce that product and get it to you. The next category that will be relevant to you is fuel and energy related activities. So these are the activities that weren't covered in your scope 1 and 2 emissions. And so a lot of times this comes into play when you see something called well to wheel. So when we're talking about fuel, we want to make sure that we have all the fuel covered, right from the exploration, the getting it out of the ground, the pumping, the transportation, all of that, where usually our scope 1 factors are only including what's called a tank to wheel or a boiler to exhaust. So what we want to do is make sure we're covering those upstream emissions that come from it. And I've listed 2 here. It's the fuel factors and electricity transmission losses. Transmission losses, you have to be a little careful because a lot of factors are now including them in their Scope 2 factors. So if they're already included in Scope 2, you do not want to include them here. This, in my opinion, is the category with the greatest opportunity for double accounting. So you really do have to look into your Scope 1 and 2 emission factors first to see what they do include. I know a lot of DEFRAs and other factors for fuel do now include well-to-wheel. So just include them in your Scope 1 and you don't have to worry about them here. But just be very careful about that. And it's a finer point that I will be talking about later in an example because it's an important one here. But again, just think about it. If we haven't covered it in Scope 1 and 2, and there are upstream or downstream emissions associated, we need to cover them. And then category 5, waste generation. So I think, most commercial sectors, whether it's paper, packaging, whatever it might be, this will be a relevant category. And so we just take the volume of what we've done and then we multiply that out by a factor depending on whether we've recycled it, composted it, and landfilled it, or burnt it, right? We have that as a factor as well for most factors. Fairly straightforward, that one. Next three, I think, will be the most relevant. So again, that's only 6 out of the 15, but as I said, I think we do have more that'll be relevant to most of you. But business travel, so it's a common category for professional services. Please don't forget hotels. We do have factors, very good ones in Canada now that measure your impact for a night in the hotel. Includes the heat, hot water, electricity that's going to be used in that hotel for your stay. And flights, we have very good data on how to track that now. And same with transportation and rental cars. The factors for transportation are very, very good now. We've been working on this quite a bit, or quite a while in carbon accounting. And then employee commuting. You usually want to do a quick back of the napkin calculation. And what I mean by that is there are factors that just go by an average commuter. So you can say I have 10,000 employees, put the number in per employee and see if it's relevant. It's a very, very broad estimate. And again, once you've done that estimate, you would want to get a little more iterative and do an employee commuting survey. But I think we'll talk about that a bit more. And then downstream leased assets. So again, this is extremely relevant. When a company owns a building but leases it to tenants who control the operations. So again, it's not going to be under your operational control, but those emissions are going to be in your company's Scope 3. And as I've mentioned before, the tenant will report them as Scope 1. I hope that makes sense. Okay, so potentially relevant. And so capital goods I've put here. Is there a question, Peter? I saw you pop up.
Yes,
okay.
there's actually a couple.
Oh, good. Go ahead.
Maybe we just stop here for a moment and address these two, if it's okay. So the first question is, what is the best Canadian platform we can use for Scope 3 emissions factors?
Yeah, I would start with Environment and Climate Change Canada. They do have some in there, but it is important that you're able to go abroad right now. Unfortunately, the EPA and DEFRA have us beat on Scope 3 estimates, but they're growing by the day in Canada. So I would check every time, and that input-output models from the Canadian government may be coming out any day. But yeah, very good question. But Environment and Climate Change Canada, their list of factors will shock you. They're not just all Scope 1 and 2.
Thank you, Kyle. And the next question is, if one uses cloud servers, should they also be considered Scope 3, and if so, under upstream or downstream?
Yeah, and so cloud servers, I would suggest that would maybe fall under Scope or Category 3, energy-related activities not covered in Scope 1 and 2. They are very energy intensive, and yes, absolutely, if you're using those and you're not in control of them, we should be measuring those emissions. Yeah, so I'd probably put them in Category 3 here.
And one more question. Do you need to account for employee emissions as living beings? My understanding is that this is usually not considered in Scope 3.
Yeah, no, not at all. We're just considering the actual emissions that they create getting to and from work, and then while they're at work traveling around. But yeah, a very good question. If we were doing it at a very unbelievably granular level, we may look at that. But I would also suggest to you that it would probably be de minimis. But no, we do not include the being for sure.
Thank you, Kyle.
Okay, so the potentially relevant categories, I started to talk about capital goods, and please don't ever think that I'm suggesting that you exclude capital goods, but this is more relevant for an entity that is building out quite a bit. So if you have a lot of new builds, then you do want to be calculating your embodied carbon. And this is a new term that a lot of people are hearing, but embodied carbon is the other term for scope or category one, purchase goods and services. And this category, capital goods, it's all that carbon that's embodied in it to get it to you. And so if you are building a lot, then this category two will definitely be relevant to you. If you've swapped out one HVAC unit in the last 5 years, well, then I would suggest it's probably not worth doing and it won't be relevant. But a verifier, a validator might want to see why you didn't include it. So if you did do that in one HVAC, then you could do an estimate for those emissions and just let them know that it's less than 1/10 of 1%, and we're not going to spend our time on that. Category four, upstream transportation and distribution. So again, applicable where physical goods are regularly shipped to the site from supplier locations. These emissions include freight, courier services, and third parties, logistics. So as I said, it definitely goes here in scope three, category four. But if we owned the trucks that are delivering our goods, then it would be in scope one. And so a very clear delineation there. But for the most part, companies do not own the trucks that are bringing all their physical goods to them. So this is where we're going to make sure to cover it in upstream transportation. And we're going to do so by ton miles. So you don't have to worry about measuring empty trucks going back and all that. The factors have done unbelievable due diligence to get a ton mile very accurate. And then category eight, upstream leased assets. So we've talked about this. If there's leased space or equipment that you do not own, you want to have the emissions that are associated with the operations in your scope three here. Category nine, very similar to our upstream transportation. But as I said, the clear delineation here is who's paying for it. So if you're paying for your downstream transportation with the sales of your product, then it would actually be up in your upstream category. So I shouldn't have said downstream, outgoing. So if your outgoing product you pay for the transportation with as part of the sale, then it would be upstream, even though it's outgoing. And this is the only real kind of complex, or not complex, but goes counterintuitively. But just remember that. Think about who's paying for it, and that will dictate whether it's upstream or downstream transportation. We've talked about this a bit, the use of sold products. If a company sells a product or device that uses energy, so electronics, all these appliances, you do need to cover it here. And this is the one that does overwhelm people, and I don't blame them. If I were to look at Canadian Tire and think that you have to actually quantify and measure all of the energy from all the products that you use. And in fact, if Canadian Tire did do a proper due diligence on a scope three, they would be including category 11. And this is one of the examples where a lot of people in carbon accounting get quite worked up about double accounting. It happens all the time in scope three. You do not ever want double accounting within your own carbon footprint. But the use of sold products, it's not just Canadian Tire who's measuring these emissions, it's the manufacturer of the products as well. Because again, it's their full supply chain as well. So there are factors out there for you. Companies have done a lot of effort to measure the energy, to measure the efficiency of their products. They usually do something what's called an environmental product declaration, an EPD. And what that does is lays out all the carbon and everything else that comes with that product. And you read from that to get the answers that you need. Category 15. So again, potentially relevant, but do your due diligence to make sure it's not. But if you are a company with a lot of investments, then you might want to look into this. But it usually just applies for investing firms or asset managers. So I leave it there because, again, there's a lot of investments, portfolios, and assets that aren't directly related to the company. So if you have those investments, there is a scan on how to go about looking at those to see whether they're relevant. Okay, our time's okay. Let me continue on. So this is, I can't suggest more, but if you ever have a problem, this is where you start. There's lots of quantification guidance in the world. ISO 14064, as I said, is teaming up with the Greenhouse Gas Protocol to become one. I would suggest to you right now that they're very, very close documents anyway. It's just slightly different language in certain places. But what this document does and what all of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol literature does is it really explains the fine details and those gray areas that you might find yourself in. ISO is a little bit more prescriptive and doesn't really talk about what may happen or how to handle certain situations. And this corporate value chain guidance has a whole chapter for each one of these categories that we've just gone over. Further appendix to how to look into them deeper if you need to, if you are an investment firm or these other things. So please make sure it's bookmarked. If you're ever doing a Scope 3 quantification, have that bookmarked on your browser as you will be referring to it quite a bit. And I'd also suggest that if you were to try and do a Scope 3 assessment without reading this document first, I would suggest you're not in the best place. I'd read it at least a couple times. Okay, so we've done step one. Let's assume we've gone through and we've done our relevance mapping. We know exactly which of those 15 categories are relevant to us, and now we want to do some quantification. We actually want to start our Scope 3 footprint. What do we do? So to quantify, I think I've talked about this already. There's really three different steps on how to do it. The first one is a spend-based method. And don't worry if you end up having a few spend-based that are very persistent in your Scope 3 footprint for years. If that's the best you can do, that's still better than not doing it. And so the spend-based estimates, like we said, those input-output models, and just simply multiply the purchase value by an emission factor. So it's quite straightforward, but usually it's very conservative. And what I mean by that is it's overestimating emissions, just to make sure that they're not, undercutting anything. The next step in the better form is an activity-based method. So we're going to actually multiply physical quantities of something by the number that we've purchased. So we have an activity data, example, kilograms of paper, number of laptops, and then we're going to look through all of these LCA databases or these EPDs, and we're going to look for the answers for that. A lot of times, industry associations will coalesce the best factors that they think that you should be using as well. So very, very helpful for a lot of these activity-based metrics. But the very best one that we have and that we really can't ignore is a supplier-specific method. And this is what the CDP, SBTI, and everyone's really pushing you towards, is the actual greenhouse gas data from the supplier that you're using. So if you're buying washing machines, there's probably a general factor for washing machine input through the whole world. There's maybe a factor for them in just North America. But if you're buying from, say, green source manufacturer, and they have an EPD showing exactly how many emissions are coming from that washing machine, and they've had it third-party verified, well, then that's the most accurate you're going to get. And so we're always pushing for that. But what it means is there's a bit more work in Scope 3, right? Scope 1 and 2, you don't have all this engagement and talking back and forth. And do you have an EPD? Do you have an LCA? When do you plan to have it? Do you at least have Scope 1 and 2 emissions at this point? Things like this take a bit more time than would it just collecting data year after year at a Scope 1 or 2. So engagement's needed. But we're always trying to iterate our carbon footprint towards this, the best metric that we have. Okay, so a couple examples, and as I said, you don't have to get too caught up on the math. They're just very general examples that I've put together, but this is one for purchase goods and services. And what I've done is given you two slides, one of a spend-based metric, and the next one we're actually going to break this down into activity data. So for here, it's quite straightforward. We're looking for all our spend that we've had on office supplies. And so in this example, we spent $10,000 last year on office supplies. And we can just simply go to the US EPA, find an input-output model for all general office supplies, and they've actually done their math. And they have a factor for you of 0.31 kilograms of CO2e per dollar spent Canadian. And again, I've adjusted for Canadian. Always watch your metrics. As for those of you who have not heard that term CO2e before, what that is we're changing all gases so it's equivalent to carbon dioxide so we can measure it in one apple to apple, as they say. So all the methane and nitrous is converted by their global warming potentials, and then we're calculating it all back to a carbon dioxide equivalent. Your carbon footprint will always be listed in a carbon dioxide equivalent, just so you don't have to explain all the nitrous and methane to everybody. Although please do separate that out in your reporting because it's important for other reasons. Okay, so this one's simply $10,000 times the 0.31 kilograms of CO2e per dollar equals 3,100 kilograms, so 3.1 tons for our purchased goods and services. Is that relevant compared to the rest of our footprint? Well, we don't know until we do a full scope 3, right? Is it going to be 40% or more? But we go step by step to see how we're doing. This example, I just wanted to show you how we just talked about getting better, the next step. And so in this example, it's the exact same $10,000 worth of supplies, but we've had the opportunity from purchasing to really break it up. And so we have recycled copy, paper listed, ballpoint pens, toner, desk, office filing folders, all of these. And so we're able to find environmental product declarations for each one of them. And if you look at the very middle column, there's an emissions factor for each one of them. What you have to be careful here is the units that they use, but it looks like all our units are lining up. We have reams for recycled copy paper, and then units for the rest of them. Hello, Peter. Are you still on?
I'm still here. I think someone else dropped.
Okay. Can you still see my screen?
Yes, quite clearly.
Okay. Yeah, I had mine drop and then the teams come up, so I'll keep going. Okay.
Okay, very good. Thanks.
So, yeah, so if we look at this example, all we're doing is really getting a bit more granular. But what I want to show is that look at the answer. So 2.1 tons. In the previous slide, we had 3.1. And this is very common. When you start becoming more granular, when you start doing more activity-based and more supplier-supplied information, your emissions usually do fall. And it's just because of that conservativeness approach that I mentioned to you. If we're doing a spend base, we want to make sure that at least that amount of emissions were captured. But a lot of people do have in their planned reductions for scope 3 up to 20 to 30% reduction in them just by getting your mathematics better. And that's definitely not cheating. A lot of people say, well, that's just, you're setting yourself up for reductions by using spend base first. Well, that's part of the iteration. And we're all being pushed towards that supplier supplied information. And when we get there, we're going to have an accurate footprint. Category 3, so we talked about this quite a bit. It's that energy consumed by our reporting organizations that's not covered in scope 1 and 2, such as extraction, refining, transportation, and just transmission losses. So in our example, we've just used a very simple one for electricity. We've looked at our Ontario emissions factor, and we've done our due diligence. We've looked into it, and it does not include transmission and distribution losses. So we're going to go look for anything that we can to find that loss of rate. I think ISO has technical reports each year about transmission losses. I've just used 7% here as an example. Please, that is not, it's probably high for Ontario. They do have a global average you can use if you're ever don't have any data at 8%. But what we do is take that 7% loss and we take it against that factor. And so we've already, measured the kilowatts of electricity used in scope 2 using that 0.044, but now we want to use that 0.0031 for our scope 3 emissions to really make sure that we're capturing our transmission and losses. And so we simply calculate our kilowatt hours by that new factor, and we come up with a very small number, 310 kilograms. It usually is a smaller number, but again, we don't want to ignore it. And for some organizations using more electricity, it will certainly be relevant. And then the same for diesel. So we want to make sure that we've talked about it, that tank to wheel is not just our only metric. We want well to tank, and in fact, well to wheel. And so you've maybe heard of these things called cradle to grave, but in fuel talk, we really do talk well to wheel. And so traditionally, in scope 1, we just go tank to wheel, the emissions that are created from our car or from our mobile fuel as we're using it. But in fact, we do want to make sure that we're getting those exploration, extraction, refining, and transportation emissions all included here as well. So these factors are quite readily available. As I said, transportation is the one where you're going to find a lot of factors quite easily. But the upstream emissions factor for diesel in Canada is 0.36 kilograms of CO2e per liter. And so we're just going to simply calculate that out. Our 10,000 liters times the factor gives us 3.6 tons of carbon dioxide. So again, I'm not speaking about whether it's relevant here, just showing you how to calculate them. But fuel and energy related activity is something that you really shouldn't miss. But just for that one fine point, please double check the factors that you're using for your scope 1 and 2. If they're a really good, fantastic factor like DEFRA's for transportation that already includes well to wheel, then you do not need to include fuel emissions here. If you're using an electricity factor that includes transmission and distribution losses, which is becoming more popular, you don't need to include it here. So do your due diligence on those before reporting on this category. Category 5 is really straightforward. We're just looking at the solid waste generated by an organization, but we have different factors depending on what we do with it. So landfilling, recycling, composting, incineration, and we do include wastewater treatment as well. So the preferred method is weight-based, and we're just going to simply multiply the amount of commercial mixed landfill by this greenhouse gas factor that you can find from ECCC for a landfill. Environment and Climate Change Canada always tries to do their best, but I do know that individual provinces as well have a lot of information on greenhouse gas factors. And I would suggest that, if you do have one provincially, it may be a more accurate number than the one generalized from ECCC. But for their factor, they're saying there's 480 kilograms of CO2e per ton. And so if we calculate our 2 tons of mixed commercial weight, we get 960 kilograms of CO2e. Before I leave this slide, I hope that impacts you to think that for every ton of waste, almost half of it is going up into the atmosphere as greenhouse gases. Anything that we can do to reduce waste is something that we should be looking for. So I've given you 2 examples here for paper, and the second one I'm going to just pause because it's not the best example, but this is the same if you're going to send office paper to a landfill. And for this factor, we have the same as the previous one, 480 kilograms of CO2e. So again, probably a bit of a generalized factor. But if you have 1 ton of paper sent, then you're going to have 480 kilograms of CO2e. And it represents the emissions associated with sending that full 1 ton of office paper to landfill. And that'll include the decomposition and methane generation while it's there. So this slide, take with a grain of salt, but what I'm trying to do here is show you the avoided emissions compared to recycling, or from recycling compared to landfill. So you wouldn't use this number in your carbon footprint, but if you were looking at what reductions might take place, if you all of a sudden sent all of your paper for recycling compared to landfill, well, you see a tremendous difference here, right? And the difference isn't just that 480 that we saw before, but it's actually the reduction in emissions created from virgin forests and production of paper as well. But again, just take this with a grain of salt, because if you were to actually do your carbon footprint for office paper, your factor should be positive. There's still some impact for it. But there's also factors here if you're looking for avoided emissions. But as I said, be very careful with this. And as you know, if we do ever have an avoided emission, it's counted outside of our footprint, not within it. Okay, business travel.
Kyle, do you have a moment for a couple of
Yes,
questions?
absolutely. Yeah, sorry, Peter, go ahead.
The first question is, how do you account for old capital goods sold to companies into refurbishing and reselling, giving capital goods a second life? An example given is companies such as Restore.
Yeah, very good question. You're going to make sure that, if you have something that you've reused, that you're going to make quantify that. And so the best example that I could have for that is, I believe it was the train station in Vancouver that actually kept their original foundation instead of tearing down the whole building. You will get credit for that lack of concrete that has to be driven away, brought back and forth. And so it's a difficult thing. I'm not suggesting it's easy to do because the factors for something previously you had or might not have quantified, but absolutely reusing or recycling has a tremendous impact when you're calculating embodied carbon. Thanks for that question. Yeah.
And the second question is, like well to wheel for fossil fuels, should one consider carbon emissions related to making hydropower or a nuclear power plant too?
Absolutely. And so that's where I talk about those upstream emissions. Our factor traditionally for electricity has just been from what it's taken for their site to produce it. But if there's upstream emissions for the exploration, the building of a dam, building of a nuclear plant, all of those should be taken into account. Have we traditionally? No. We focused very much on operational emissions as opposed to the building emissions, but those are changing now. And I would suggest that if you are doing a proper footprint going forward and you were an electricity producer, then you would include any kind of facilities that you're building. Absolutely.
Thank you, Kyle. That's all for now.
Okay, so business travel. I don't think I'm going to spend too much time on this one. It's fairly straightforward. You're always going to be looking for a passenger kilometer as opposed to the spend base. But, if you don't have that passenger kilometer, then spend base is fine for a couple of years. What I've found in a lot of companies is that they have their total amount in their travel report, but they never put to and from. Well, they just added it. Where are you going to? Where are you coming from? And as soon as you have that, you can do a much more iterative travel or business travel assessment. And so here's one example, 5 employees round trip from Toronto to Vancouver, 6,700 kilometers. You can find these emission factors for domestic air in Environment and Climate Change Canada, and they're kind of fascinating. There'll always be 3 different factors for air travel: a short flight, a medium flight, and a long flight, as they all react quite differently per passenger kilometer. Takeoffs and landings are very fuel intensive. But simply, we go through the calculation here. 5 employees, 6,700 kilometers times that factor of 0.135 kilograms per passenger kilometer, and we get 4.5 tons of CO2e. Business travel usually does add up fairly quickly, but since the pandemic and all this Teams activity and a lack of traveling, people are seeing it in their carbon footprints. And then here I just mentioned again, don't forget your hotel accommodations. So these people, it's a total of 15 room nights between them, 5 employees for 3 nights. We have an emissions factor for Environment and Climate Change Canada, 15 kilograms of CO2e per room night. That includes all the natural gas for heating and all the electricity needed. And so for those 15 room nights, it was 225 kilograms of CO2e. And usually those hotel accommodations are a smaller component of it, but we don't want to forget it. Okay, and employee commuting. I think I talked about this enough. You're going to do all you can to look into your employee commuting, probably on a spend or a simple metric first. But if you can, you definitely want to do an employee commuting survey. It's just going to add that much more accuracy to it. But at this point, if we have a general factor that we've used, 240 days that we're working per year, 20-kilometer round trip, and 25 employees, you can always look for assumptions. So the Canadian average in the 2021 consensus was 74% of commuters actually drive. So we're just going to put a general driving factor for a regular car from Environment Canada, emissions factor of 0.192 kilograms, and we're going to multiply that out. I hope that you're getting the sense that, we're really rounding the edges on a lot of this. Is it really 20 kilometers average? Do they all work 240? Is there no teleworking? Is it really 74%? So all of this can just be so simply rectified with a proper employee commuting survey. And, if you only get even 40% of your employees reporting back, it's still going to be much more accurate on an iterative level than doing some of these assumptions. And so again, I've talked about it here using an internal commuting survey. If you do, then you got to be a little more refined. You got to look for the gasoline used in the car. You got to use a transit emission, biking, walking, these things. Takes a little more effort, but as I said, much more accurate carbon footprint. And if we look again, 17 tons for this one when we're using averages, and we're down to 16 tons when we're getting a little more iterative. Something that you will find in practice quite a bit. Downstream leased assets, I think I've talked quite a bit about this, but it is probably going to be your biggest contingent of Scope 3. When you're leasing out or have facilities that are leased to someone else, if they have control over the operations, then that's their Scope 1 and 2. But we want to make sure that we're including in our Scope 3 here. And if tenant data is not available, you can use proxy data on occupancy, building type, or historical usage. And even if you don't have any of that, Environment and Climate Change Canada has an average per square meter for different types of building. Commercial, refrigerator, grocery store, all these different things, they've done their estimate. And so all you need is the square meters, and you can make a pretty good assessment. But as I said, the better data you can get, the more accurate our footprint's going to be. So here's a bit of an example. A tenant electricity consumption of 300,000 kilowatt hours. Very straightforward on calculating that emission. I'm not going to spend time. We have the emissions factor from Ontario, the natural gas, and then we're going to combine them. And so I have 81 tons here just as an example, but I do think that when you're measuring your category 13 emissions, it will be one of your largest ones for the commercial sector. Again, depending on offices, retail, hospitality, they all differ so much, but I would expect this to be the case. Okay, and so the other potentially relevant ones, capital goods, as I said, if you're building a lot, upstream transportation and distribution, upstream leased assets, do your due diligence to see whether these are really relevant to you, but we're going to make sure that we capture them. And then same with downstream transportation and distribution. I'm sure that for a lot of retail stores, this will certainly be relevant. And then same with the use of sold products. Don't get caught up in the complexity too much. There's a term called analysis or paralysis by analysis. And you can get yourself worked up but just start. It's all I can ask you is just, start this process and you'll feel a lot better about uncovering some of this data and the metrics that are out there to help you. And then the last category. So, it might be relevant to depending on what you are within the commercial sector, but it includes the emissions associated with the investments made by the reporting organization. So equity holdings, loans, project finance. As I said, it's almost always most relevant to financial institutions and pension funds, asset managers. But read the chapter and at least do your due diligence to say why you can exclude it. We don't have any investments. Excellent. We only have a minor few investments, but they're all within the same portfolio of ours, and per square meter, they should be relevant. If you have a whole holding in a coal exploration or a coal mine, be careful. Those are a tremendous investment with a whole bunch of emissions associated with it. So just do your due diligence, but as I said, this is probably not relevant to most of you. Okay, how our time? We have 20 minutes left. I only have a couple more slides and then we'll leave it open for some questions. So reporting and assurance. The first, it says here to integrate Scope 3 with Scope 1 and 2, but you do not have to do that right away. And what I mean by that is, a lot of times people are worried that the scope three, the first time they did it, it's either too much spend based or too much guessing or too many assumptions, and they do not want to disclose it publicly. I do not blame you. And I think that that's probably good business practice. Do the first year the best you can, put processes in place to improve it for the next year, and then do it again. By doing 2 years in a row, it brings you to the conclusion that, there's better ways to do things here, there's better sources of data here, but it also gives you a lot more comfortability in that you've now completed two and you're comfortable to now disclose it. When you do report all three, you're reporting that one carbon footprint. What's your footprint? It's 78,000 tons of CO2e per year. Well, that includes scope one, two, and three. But we're going to be very clear that we're going to list them out and separate them for people who want to read our sustainability report. But again, as soon as we measure them, they're now part of our footprint, and we don't want to forget about that. And then the other thing that I'd mentioned about scope three is preparing for assurance. So if you do find yourself in a situation where you need a third-party validator, your scope one and two emissions, if you're a large final emitter in Canada, well, then you need a reasonable level of assurance. It's just part of the regulation. You're not getting away with anything less. But on a scope three, a reasonable level of assurance is kind of a hard bar to reach. And so that's where we get a limited level of assurance. It's just more of a high level review. The verifiers looked into what they can look for material errors. They've probably done a sensitivity analysis from year to year to see if there's any significant changes that you can't explain. But it would not entail a site visit. It would not entail, the calibration or reviewing the calibration of meters and things like this. So usually a bit cheaper, but also it can be quite complex because it's quite large. So I shouldn't say the cost is always less, but a limited level of assurance is a lower bar than a reasonable level of assurance. And so if you did break up your carbon footprint and had a reasonable level of assurance for scope one and two, and a limited level of assurance for scope three, I would suggest that that's very good business practice. To try and get reasonable for all of them, you're pushing the limits quite a bit. In alignment with CDP, TCFD, and SBTI. So as I've mentioned, scope three reporting is increasingly expected. So even though Greenhouse Gas Protocol and ISO call it optional reporting, these bodies, it's just expected at this point. So if you choose to do this process because you want to report for ESG, don't skimp on your scope three. Do the best job that you can right off the get-go and make people aware that it's going to be iterative over time and being improved over time. That really caveat there, that 40% of your total, if it's included, you do need to include it in SBTI targets. And SBTI is the leading validated science-based target organization on the planet right now. And if you do want to go net zero with them, it's the same situation. 40% of the total must be included. And then this one, again, I wanted to leave with one more statement about it, but disclosures under TCFD should address the value chain risks and opportunities. This is when you're looking into the scope three data with a little more clarity. If you find out that you are having, one supplier and there's only one supplier of a main product that you need, and they're in a very climate risky area, well, it might be time to look for a different supplier where you might not have saw that perspective before you did your scope three data. Investors are curious, but I should suggest that in my practice, risk assessment is quite expensive. The accounting firms are charging quite a bit for risk assessments at your facilities organizations. So be careful with that. Do all you can to look into the risks, but if you do have to outsource them, be prepared depending on your organization. Okay, so we've come to the end here. I just wanted to give you one slide because I really want to make sure that you're leaving this feeling that you know where to start conducting a materiality review. So in other words, you know where to go to the input-output models. You know how to scan those 15 categories to start saying, no, this one's not relevant. This one may be. Let's do a back of the napkin calculation. Hope that you can train the relevant staff on scope three data collection and reporting. It doesn't mean that you have to take them out and give them a 3-week course, but to let them know about, what format the data is best for you to come in, let them know when each year that you'll be requiring this information, can be very handy for sure. Begin outreach with your high impact suppliers and data sharing or improvement. So, as I said, this is something that makes people cringe a bit. A lot of these people who are usually handling a carbon footprint are engineers or energy managers, and outreach, talking to your suppliers, asking them for things. That's not a comfortable situation, but there are ways to do it, especially just when you go out for a tender on anything. Now just include a simple line at the bottom. Do you have a carbon assessment of your product? If so, please include it. You're going to find that the vast majority don't at this point, but the number who do, it's growing exponentially by day. Review internal systems for storing and updating Scope 3 estimates. So as I said, if your current travel estimate is only a spend base and it doesn't have to and from, well, there's a little bit of pushback that you can have there. It doesn't take people that much longer to put where they've gone to and where they're coming from on a travel report. And if it's now on that paper and requested of people, it now will be there. And then explore assurance readiness, starting with limited assurance for key categories. And so that's when I mention again, you might want to do a year of this before you disclose to absolutely anybody. That would probably be, in my opinion, good business practice. And so if that's the way you're going to go about it, I applaud you. If you're confident enough with your numbers right off the bat to get it verified and to report to CDP, I applaud you even more. And at that, Peter, I'll leave it open for some questions.
Yes, thank you, Kyle. We have one question related to Scope 3 data because it's not under the company's control, and that this might increase purchasing managers' work to ask suppliers about their carbon footprints and put some dollar value to it.
Yeah, and there's no question. And so you might get a little pushback from your purchasing department, but what your goal is to really make it as streamlined as possible. And so I know Unilever just started by simply asking that question at the bottom. Do you calculate carbon for your product? Yes or no? That's it. And so they started simply, but at least it was a signal to their suppliers that this was now important to them. And then from there, if you do, you can just list simply, do you have an EPD? But yeah, you're right. We are asking other departments to increase their workload to get a proper footprint. Part of the process, yes.
And then the follow-up question is, how do you calculate that dollar value for Scope 3 emissions for supplies?
Yeah, so you're going to actually go to your accounting department and you're going to ask them, pull your top your top suppliers, your top spend metrics on what you purchased this year. And it'll shock you. It's not the first time they've been asked for this. Other departments will have asked them for their top spend and their top suppliers for other reasons, whether it's, corporate wanting to make sure that those suppliers are treated very well, or other iterations. But yes, you want to go to the accounting department and ask them, last year, what were the top 20 things that we spent money on, and get a list of them. And then that's your job to go through and start placing those in the categories and seeing which ones would be relevant.
Great, thank you, Kyle. Are there any final questions from the audience? We have a few minutes left. You can also raise your hand or turn on your mic and camera if you like.
Good. And I know you had a few more slides too here, Peter, so let me know when you want me to change.
Yeah, why don't we go ahead and advance to those?
Sure.
Yeah, and as I'm going through these, like I said, because we have a few more minutes, if you have questions, feel free to pop them in the chat. So we just want to draw your attention to the fact that there's various resources provided by the ISO Save on Energy, including virtual one-on-one coaching. You can sign up for the monthly bulletin if you haven't already to receive monthly training updates. You can always check the live training calendar. I'll put the link to this also into the chat to make it easy to register for upcoming events and workshops. And you can also check out the training and support webpage for access to everything that we've done to date, all the trainings and materials to check them out, including the training that Kyle did previous to this on Scope 1 and 2 emissions for the commercial sector. Yeah, I think we can go ahead and move past this one, Kyle. Yes, so I'll just put a few of the upcoming trainings in the chat to make related to the commercial sector to invite you to register for those if you're interested in the training and support calendar. And if we don't have any further questions, I'd really like just to thank Kyle for his excellent training today.
Peter.
And to also thank the audience, the attendees, for your time and for your great questions and helping to make the training even more useful to everyone. So thanks again, and we look forward to seeing you at future events.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, everybody.